Hello everyone, this is Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline. I'm here today with Donna Brooks. Donna is a registered somatic movement educator and therapist and a certified yoga therapist. Her approach to yoga is very much about getting in touch with the body's inner wisdom and our capacity to heal by enhancing our interoceptive awareness and tapping into the subtle signs in the body that will take us on a healing path. So welcome, Donna.
Very nicely said, Lynn. That was very beautiful.
Well,
Thank
you
you.
know what? Tell us a little bit more about that. What does it mean to be a somatic movement specialist?
Well, what somatic movement does is it avoids prescribing an ideal posture or an ideal movement. What it works to do is unwind limitations in our structure and our function that get in the way of being naturally healthy and whole. So the body wants to move to homeostasis, but because we have these constrictions from anything really, accidents, injuries, emotional traumas, maybe not going through our developmental patterns fully when we were younger, toddlers and babies. Those things all put limits on our bodies and our minds and our emotions. And somatics just allows us to go so deeply into our bodies experientially that we can unwind those patterns. And then life becomes more full and whole.
You know, it sounds a little bit like you're saying, and I mean this in a really good way, it's subtractive rather than additive, because I just had this conversation with a client today who had some really bad structural problems in his body, and he goes and works out in the gym every day. And I said, you're sort of etching that dysfunctional spinal arrangement in with heavy equipment every day. And what we have to first do is take away some of the dysfunction.
Absolutely. That's very true. So it is good to exercise. It is good to strengthen, but many people do those things based on a lot of dysfunction in their bodies, and it just makes the dysfunction more set and worse.
Yeah.
So yesterday I was teaching actually a pelvic floor workshop. And there was a woman in the workshop who has become familiar with an approach to prolapse, pelvic floor prolapse, that prescribes a very specific posture that's really extreme. And it just really shone a light on for me, again, how important it is to not try to put something on your body to fix it, but to take away that subtractive quality you were talking about so that the body finds itself. And as the body finds itself, it will find its posture. And I'm sure you know, as a yoga therapist yourself, that no two people's bodies are alike. No two people are going to look the same way. So if we go from the outside and try to enforce what everyone should look like, we're missing the boat. When I taught the somatic yoga class for YogaUOnline, I had a photo in the slideshow of different hip joints. There were like 4 different hip joints in people to just illustrate, to illuminate how people's hips are shaped very radically differently. So that means it's not really appropriate to have the same hip openers. They should not look the same way. And we can miss that in our culture because we're very focused on looking in the mirror, like we can't help it. We're taught that we measure ourselves through what we see from the outside rather than what we feel from the inside.
I think that is a particular landmine for yoga teachers and yoga students who think there's a way that something should look rather than working, as you do, sort of from that interoceptive awareness. You mentioned pelvic floor, and that's kind of what I wanted to touch on today, because pelvic floor issues are pretty rampant. But I think that they're more widespread than what people understand. I think a lot of people, when they hear pelvic floor dysfunction, think of incontinence, childbirth, prolapse, prostate. But I think there's also a lot of places where pelvic floor dysfunction or misalignment is one of the factors that we might not recognize. Can you talk about what you see in terms of pelvic floors?
Talking about hip openers, that's interesting, because yesterday one of the things I did in the workshop is I looked at the connection between, like, say, a reclining cobbler's pose and the fluidity, the elasticity, the openness of the anal levator muscles. And that's said different ways. Some people just call them the levator muscles or the levator ani muscles or anal levator muscles. But they are this group of muscles that go from the tailbone out to your ischium bones and even come forward towards your pubic bone. And they basically function in a way as a fan. So if you let that fan be an important part of what dictates the extension of your hips, you've got a really different hip opening, and a hip opening, I would argue, that's more integrated with the fullness of your body. So perhaps that's something that you mean.
You're kind of talking about working from the center of your body out to the extremity versus working from the ball and socket joint to do a mechanical.
In yoga in particularly, that bone and socket joint is often overstretched, because what happens is the goal becomes how wide can you stretch, how far can you go, how deep you can go into the posture, rather than looking at the function of what the joint really needs. And I'm a person, so my background, aside from somatics, is I did Iyengar yoga for many years, which is, a hard yoga to do. And there's a lot admirable in Iyengar yoga. I don't want to be dissing it at all, because I honor Mr. Iyengar. And it took me a long time to kind of put my joints back together, in the sense that joints need to have openness, but they also need to have security. And the overemphasis on stretching as far as I can and as deeply as I could really was not helpful to my particular body. Now, to Mr. Iyengar's body, was a really different body type. That approach makes a lot of sense. So you really have to look at who the individual is and what they need when you're working. And then, yes, I would say, I'm not trying to say like everything should come from the core out to the periphery, although that is important, but we also can work with movement and intelligence of movement and posture and structure from the periphery to the core. They have slightly different feelings and slightly different effects, but it's important to integrate everything together. So you're not just looking at like the pelvic floor in isolation of the legs and the feet. And ideally, I'd have a lot of time with people so we could, work with the jaw, the roof of the mouth and the pelvic floor, the kidneys and bladder and the pelvic floor, because all of this is interconnected. And sometimes there's a very specific key in a person's body to unlock or help correct an imbalance that, isn't the obvious thing.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was asking about, whether a pelvic floor imbalance can show up as, malocclusion.
Oh, definitely.
in your jaw, or low back pain, or, and you wouldn't ever go, oh, it's my pelvic floor dysfunction. You would say, oh, my, erector muscles are weak or something. But really there's
often connections. So like some of the more prominent connections are like pelvic floor and your arches of your feet, definitely pelvic floor and your jaw. And that said, how our hips are positioned has a lot to do with what goes on in our pelvic floor. Our gait, habits of gait, habits of sitting, all of these things impact the pelvic floor muscles, and the pelvic floor muscles then go on to destabilize places in our body that show up as other things.
You touched on yoga. Do yogis sometimes make it worse by all of the asymmetrical work that sometimes gets done, or you talked about hip openers. I think sometimes about people doing asymmetrical poses that are challenging, but with dysfunctional posture, for example.
Well, the challenge of asymmetrical poses is that we're so different from side to side. And that's where yoga therapy is brilliant versus a yoga class, because if you're just in a yoga class or following a yoga routine, you don't typically address those sides differently. And you really do need to address them differently because, I mean, some people are more symmetrical than others, but we all have asymmetry.
Yeah. Now, outside of yoga or walking, there are lifestyle issues that might impact pelvic floor health, correct?
Yes.
Weight management, stress.
Yes.
Trauma.
Weight management, stress, trauma, sexual trauma. One of my colleagues is pretty very well respected pelvic floor PT, and she works a lot definitely with sexual trauma and the pelvic floor. That's pain can come from abuse, and that's a big trauma. On a more sort of mundane level, constipation is a very big issue for the pelvic floor. Stress, like nerves, anxiety, more like autonomic function in particular, has a really big effect on the bladder. That's what those drugs are always trying to sell us, nervous bladder. And that has a lot to do with autonomic function. There are definitely studies showing that there's a lot of good value in doing biofeedback to just retrain your nervous system in relationship to your bladder for that kind of situation. Weight puts a lot of pressure down on the pelvic floor. And then you have the opposite. You have where the pelvic floor, I think this is changing now, but in the last, say 5 or 7 years, it became sort of a fitness goal to have a strong pelvic floor. And so there's a lot of tightening and pulling up, really intense kind of Kegeling. They have those jade eggs that you can squeeze and pull up. And for some people, that is great. See, this is where we come back to the person again. Some people need that. But for someone who's already, say, doing a lot of Pilates, where the sort of scooping already encourages a lot of pulling in and up on the pelvic floor can get too tight. And that can contribute to sexual dysfunction. That can contribute to pain. That can contribute to difficulty with urination.
I also think you mentioned Kegels. That's a pet peeve of mine, because there are people who think you're supposed to do Kegels all the time, and what Kegels are is just squeeze the hell out of everything from the waist down, and just squeeze everything.
Well, what I find really interesting is that there are some more obscure but more traditional, like Bandha Mala movements in yoga that have to do with lifting the anal sphincter, the urinary sphincter, and the sphincter around the vagina. And so there is potentially an energetic use for those kind of lifting and slight squeezing. There's definitely variations of Kegels that are more gentle that people can use even in a directed way, like someone who's having a lot of bladder incontinence, to be able to control that sphincter could be very, very useful. And that is different than a Kegel. And I don't know if this is absolutely true. This could be a urban myth. I haven't really researched it. But what I've been told about Kegels from people who have studied this is that Kegels were originally designed to make women's vaginas tighter after birth. They were not about pelvic floor health. They were about sexual fulfillment.
Returning to sexual form.
For the husband, yes.
For the
and for the wife too, I guess. But it was more the muscularity of the vagina than the health of the entire pelvic floor.
Even when you were describing it, you went to a soft voice, a gentle gesture. You talked about a subtle movement, which all of those seem to me so different from the way society does Kegels, which is
grip and pull. And there's a lot of variations in physical therapy too, because some physical therapists are still very into old-fashioned kind of Kegeling. And they even have little devices, like little tampons that you can grab a hold of and squeeze and lift. And then other PTs are looking more at either a gentle lifting approach, or does this person even need a Kegel? Because again, if you have a lot of tightness in the pelvic floor, then Kegeling's like overworking something.
You're tightening something that's already tight.
And it's not like your glutes, which, you know, I don't know if there is any end to really having strong glutes. Like they propel us, they are like our engine. So you probably can't overdo your glutes, but you can overdo your pelvic floor.
I think the shape of the glutes and the attachments of the glutes prevent you from overdeveloping the glutes. Whereas the pelvic floor muscles, that's a very delicate little, lovely little basket. And,
yes, it's lovely. I love how you said that. It is very lovely. And it holds those organs, and this is another thing I think people don't really think about with the pelvic floor. They think organs and muscles. So you got to keep the muscles tight enough so the organs don't drop. Right? I mean, because a lot of people only do come to pelvic floor when they have prolapse. I mean, either prolapse or pain is basically what draws people to pelvic floor. But all of those organs are in fascial slings, and all those fascial slings are connected to the skeletal structure through tendons. So it's really a fascial network that's supporting the organs of the pelvic floor. And yes, the muscles are part of that network, and the muscles have to have a certain amount of elasticity, because through our breathing, those organs get really kind of compressed and they move down a little bit. They move forward too in the abdomen. And so the pelvic floor has to be elastic to accommodate that. And then the pelvic floor has to be elastic in the other direction to sort of, give a little bounce from up underneath. But the bounce is what's important. And that doesn't mean that people should be jumping all around, because if you have prolapse and you're landing on a hard surface, that's not a good jump. But like gentle bouncing, that could actually facilitate the fascia and the slings holding the organs, keeping some elasticity. And inversions, inversions, not just thinking like, taking the pressure off the pelvic floor, but really seeing if you can bring the weight into a different place, and maybe through that weight in a different place, encouraging. So this is a sort of like conflict, because I, as a somaticist or a somatic explorer, somatic practitioner, I do believe that you can and I've experienced it myself, sort of rejuice up your ligaments and tendons. From a more traditional physiological viewpoint. That's not possible. That if you go upside down, it's just you go upside down, you feel better for a little while, you take some pressure off. But my personal exploration is, can going upside down help the ligament tendon, which we can see as part of the fascia, depending on who and how people are defining fascia, if that shift in weight from the organ can actually help repair some of that tissue if it's been overstretched. And it can be overstretched from weight, it can be overstretched from pregnancy, it can be overstretched from bearing down through constipation, it could be overstretched from giving birth. So there are a lot of reasons why you might have lower pelvic organs than you would ideally like.
Okay, and that brings me to another common notion. That's another kind of, I'm not going to say pet peeve, but that the fact that, and I think Hallmark has made a lot of money out of this, that pelvic floor issues, particularly incontinence, but other issues, are age-related and inevitable. And that
I don't think they're inevitable, but there are risk factors, and, definitely.
I mean, we know we lose muscle tone. We know we gain weight with every decade. We lose fascial tone, but...
And that is tricky. But yes, but you don't have to have it. And I think another thing that is also kind of unpopular to say, but I think is true, and certainly I feel like I've lived through this generation and experienced it, over-exercising through pounding as a young woman is also not great for support of your pelvic floor. So I would say, of course, it's not inevitable. There are many people who die without having pelvic floor problems. And because, like everything else, your risk factors increase as you age. You've had more things, you know, you've been constipated more often, you've had surgeries, if you've had a childbirth where you've had your abdominal muscles torn, that is also a correlating factor.
Okay, so that's all the bad stuff. I want to talk about what you do and how you kind of fix it using a really different and very kind of intuitive almost.
Well, the first thing I do is I go back to somatics. So what keeps a lot of, let's say, pelvic dysfunction in place or any other kind of dysfunction is our habits. So if someone's got a duck foot or a pigeon toe, then that's going to affect their pelvic floor, you know, or maybe their pelvic floor is actually what caused them initially. It depends. You know, sometimes it's a foot injury that makes you turn out. Sometimes it's a hip injury. Sometimes it's a knee injury. Sometimes it's a pelvic floor injury, but you've got this turnout. That turnout is going to make one half of your pelvic floor really different than the other half. And in that case, it's going to be like a little overstretched on one side. So my approach is definitely not to say like, okay, make sure your foot faces forward. My approach is to do movements that unwind whatever the pattern is, the difficulty that doesn't let that foot go forward. And then once the foot goes forward, then actually a lot of normal activities will build this elasticity in the pelvic floor. So if you don't have like something that you need to take care of, your normal activities are going to keep your pelvic floor really fine. And maybe that's what you were talking about in terms of, yeah, it's not inevitable with aging. And the way most people age, a lot of things come up, you know, on a lot of levels, you know, like why do people get more high blood pressure when they're older? Like we just have more time to have more things go off.
Yeah.
But that's my approach, is to bring the body back to balance, look at normal function, and then do targeted strength or flexibility or both, depending on what people need. To a point, because there are also specialists who, you know, go internal, which as yoga teachers we would never do.
Yeah.
But go internal into the pelvic floor and really work with the fascia and individual muscles.
Right.
And, you know, sometimes that's really helpful. Sometimes full body fascial work is really helpful.
So in all fairness, we talked about how yogis can make things worse, but yoga can in fact be a great way to tap into balance and all of the kind of things. So could you talk about yoga and how that can be a healing modality for pelvic floor dysfunction?
If you have a consciousness of how the pelvic floor works and how it's related to your hips and your knees and your feet and your abdominals and your posture, then what you can do is really see your students or your own pelvic floor needs and integrate them into the asana that you're already doing.
And what about a practitioner, not a teacher, but a practitioner who's in a yoga class? What are some of the ways they can do self-care to make sure they're both not doing anything harmful, but also they're encouraging pelvic floor health with their practice?
What I would say generally that I have lived my career by is that a teacher is a guide, but ultimately you live in your body, so you're your best authority for your own body. So if something doesn't feel right, and it may be that you're doing it in a really weird way that you shouldn't be doing it, and it's not what the teacher's telling you to do at all, but if anything feels off or strange, don't do it. Just wait until you learn more, and don't be a hero or a heroine in class. Like, it's better to take down, if you have any doubt, it's better to take down activities and not push as far or push as hard. Because
what would be
it can take time to really...
Go ahead.
It could take time to really be able to liberate the wisdom of your own body That's like a really sensitive thing to do. And most people go to yoga classes expecting to be directed and expecting that the teacher really knows the answer. But the truth is that no one ultimately will know the answer to what your body needs better than you. So if you're in a class where that's being facilitated, I think that's really great. And if you're not in a class where that's facilitated, then you have to take it upon yourself to really respect your limits and your doubts.
So if you go back to your example of the different structures of hips, and certainly femur head angles means some people are never going to do a squat with their heels down, period, end of story. How would I know if I'm in a yoga class how to work with my hips in a somatic way that they're getting range of motion, they're getting healthy movement?
This is where I would encourage people to study somatics, because you have to have an experience, a visceral experience of your own body, and preferably even to the point of your own anatomy, that's not conceptual, but that really lets you. So for instance, what I would do in my classes, like I'm actually going to teach a happy hips class soon, is do a lot of gentle movement explorations that focus on fluidity and smoothness of movement, and that educates people as to how their hips move. They feel where they're pushing too hard or where they're holding themselves back, and it's not even an intellectual thing. It's just, is this movement becoming smoother? Is this movement becoming freer? And how is this movement affecting the rest of my posture? Because when people push or shy away, I mean, that's the other end of it too, is people may not participate enough. They may be the opposite, like too scared to do anything. And so when people shy away or push, that kind of aggression or shirking away has an effect on the entire posture and the entire system. Mm-hmm. So you can actually start to notice in yourself, you can notice it in your nervous system. When people are living their anatomical experience with integrity, the nervous system just gets really nicely chilled. There's an alertness and a calm. And with that alertness and calm, you know, there's a nice tone to the muscles. The spine loses some of the intensity of its over curves. So a lot happens when you explore in a way that lets the naturalness of the body's intelligence come forward.
So as you're speaking, I can really imagine that somatics in yoga, that combining those two things is kind of a magical...
I started in the 80s doing this. I was living in Washington, D.C. and studying Iyengar yoga with John Schumacher in the early 80s, a kind of famous Iyengar teacher. And I would go to the Feldenkrais Center, which is a form of somatic movement, not one that I'm trained in, but I am quite experienced in it from just participating with it. And so I would go to the Feldenkrais Center, and it was like almost two different things, but I was learning in my own body how to integrate them. And way before somatics really became a word, I was teaching 2-hour classes because I was so committed to Iyengar yoga, but I needed to have people find that fluidity and release before they could really approach asana.
But in finding the fluidity, if you went into a more traditional asana class and you had some somatics in your head, you could take your class and no one has to know you're doing somatics. And just bring that into...
Yes, depending on the teacher. True story. I came out of a Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen workshop on, I think we were doing kidneys and knees. And I was in this very aware place of how the fluidity or the undulations, the flow of my kidneys was really connected to how much my knees straightened. So I decided to go to a yoga class, and basically the instructor yelled at me and told me I had to leave because I wasn't following her instructions and she even used the phrase "lock my knees," which, I mean, you know, I mean, who's going to use that phrase?
I think that's changing, though. I don't know. The yoga teachers that I come in contact with are really interested in helping people getting to their their truth and to their...
Yes, and that's great. Yes. And so then it becomes like as a student, then it's like, I have a friend who, she was so proud of herself. She was going to a pretty rigorous, Baron Baptiste studio, and she was really proud of herself because she was in her 50s and everyone else was in their 30s, until she blew her knee out.
Aww.
It was just like, it was an internal thing because, she was like, I'm going to keep up with these youngsters.
Yeah.
That, it wasn't about the teachers. It was about how we look outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
To decide what we're going to do. And it's like she knew better. She regretted, that she didn't listen to herself. But it was so enticing to feel like I can do what a 35-year-old does and I'm 54,
You're right, though. That's such a numbers-based system versus age.
But we've all felt that way. I mean, it's part of our culture.
When I worked in assisted living, whenever someone came up to me and said, "How old do you think I am?" That's a dead giveaway. You're 94 or you're 95. But I would always say, everyone here looks 70 to me. And they'd all go away happy because,
I thought you were going to say, you look ageless.
No, I would just say, I don't know, everyone looks 70 here to me. So.
And as we get older, generally we do feel more benefit of paying attention to what we're experiencing.
I work with a lot of seniors, and I think what's delightful about it is that they do understand what their bodies, even the seniors who are not in touch so much with their bodies are interested in getting in touch with their bodies and becoming sort of more embodied in their lives.
Yes.
Like me, they're very good at taking what they get in the studio out into the street and into their lives.
And I think there is something to the stages of life and how we approach yoga, because young people have had less time to develop injuries and compensations, granted that everything sort of went well early on. So, and you have so much springiness and, your fascia and your joints and you got all that lubrication. So, you can injure yourself and you feel better in a couple of days. So you
don't realize it's all going away.
Yeah, why not just work as hard as you can and push yourself super hard because it feels great. And, if you hurt, it'll be gone in a few days. And that is a life stage.
Yeah.
So, yes, I mean, it is as we get older, we're more prone to want to take care of ourselves. And that feeds into the pelvic floor because, again, it's like unless there's a dysfunction or a pain, most people aren't oriented towards even thinking what the pelvic floor is.
What could we expect, though, if we did come to work in a somatic experience to get more pelvic floor balance?
Absolutely.
What kind of results? I mean, what kind of? I don't mean to be results oriented, but I mean, how would that feel different than? How would you feel differently at the end of the class than the beginning?
Usually people don't have just one somatic class and everything's put back together. It's like a watercolor painting. The more you participate with more fluid and functional movement in a gentle, curious way, the deeper your painting gets and the more it's integrated into how you live each day and each step of your life. And generally, people find that they could release or unlock into more musculoskeletal balance, including balance in their pelvic floor. And so for me, what I see is that when you know, for instance, that you can bring more, well, just think of it as like bringing more evenness to your sacral sides. Isn't it better to do a bridge pose if your sacrum is balanced on both sides and you're feeling like an even wrap in your transverse abdominis, as opposed to having more strength or weakness on one side or another? So it sort of sets the tone for you to engage with more evenness and more fullness in your body. And even if you don't achieve all that evenness and fullness at once, you have a finer sense of how to work, as you were saying before, with the asymmetry.
It also sounds like you're working like toward a much more yummy practice, a much more
it's yummy
juicy
and
and delicious, and
well,
yeah.
see, here's the other thing that's sort of, again, like this is just my sort of navigation. But I really believe that and find in myself that embodiment, which is somatic, is different than awareness. So we can be like, you can be aware of your hand, but that's a different experience than to feel different qualities and aspects of life within your hand. And once you open up that quality of life internally, it's like your organism is coming out to play, and your mind is so much less engaged, not because you're trying to make it engaged or less engaged or because you're meditating, but it lends itself to a more living, natural meditation and just clarity of thought. So in that sense, it's tremendously yummy. And, I think of people like Reginald Ray, the Buddhist teacher, who talks about how in more traditional cultures, people just were more embodied. Like they literally did chop wood, carry water. If you didn't have functional movement patterns, you wouldn't have survived very long. Your genes wouldn't have gone on. So there's potentially, with us in the West, a certain mentalization where we can observe our bodies, but we're not living deeply in as experienced bodies. And that is super yummy to get.
If you even go to like how we walk the earth.
Yeah. Oh,
we're
totally.
walking on artificial surfaces that have been paved, so there's no problem. There's no reason for your feet to feel smart or do any extra thinking. Yeah,
absolutely. It's all around us, and it's as sort of the heirs to the people who conquered the earth. Like it's our culture. So it is an opportunity. Emily Conrad Continuum was a big pioneer in somatics, and she describes she went to Haiti. She was a New York City dancer, went to Haiti, and she said movement fell apart from the cultural dissonance. And she started to experience a more intrinsic life of movement. And, that works extremely yummy. It's all about finding the internal oceanic fluids inside ourselves.
So you have a class coming up, a course on YogaUOnline. Yay! And it's really going to address this somatic repatterning in the pelvic floor. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Who should go? What are they going to learn?
Okay, so I'd say anyone who has an interest in the pelvic floor should go. And
anyone with a pelvis.
Anyone with a pelvis. Anyone who is interested in a somatic approach. It's not going to be as somatic as my last course with you, but I'm going to do some more like strength, because ultimately a lot of people do need to strengthen the pelvic floor. Or not even the pelvic floor. What people need to strengthen to support the pelvic floor is really their core, and you can't leave that out. So that's a part of this work. We're going to cover a lot of what we talked about in this interview.
Awesome.
It's very holistic and integrated.
Well, it sounds like something a lot of people are going to be interested in checking out, just to get some of those delicious sensations you were talking about.
Yeah.
Well, Donna, this has been fascinating, and I want to know so much more, so I'm going to tune into your course.
Cool. Yeah, great. Look at my website too. There's some good stuff on my website.
And thank you all for stopping by for YogaUOnline. We'll see you next time. Namaste.
Namaste.